Welcome to my presentation this evening or this morning, wherever you are in the world, about the carnivorous plants of the top end region in Australia. I'm Thilo Krueger. I'm a PhD student at Curtin University in Perth in Western Australia. I'm researching carnivorous plants, especially their ecology, but also their taxonomy. I'm describing new species, especially within sundews, within Drosera. And then I'm also doing assessments of their conservation status, which is really important to get an understanding about the threats of these carnivorous plants. So today I'm going to talk about the species that are found in the top end, and probably the most one of the most distinctive and characteristic ones of that area is already shown here, Drosera falconeri. I will of course show a lot more pictures of this one later. So here's a map of Australia, and the region I'm going to present today is marked here with this yellow box. This is called the top end region of Northern Australia, of the Northern Territory in Northern Australia. This area harbors 4 different genera of carnivorous plants. We have Aldrovanda vesiculosa, although I have to disappoint you that I'm unfortunately unable to show you pictures of that species today, because I've never seen it in the top end region. And I'm not going to cheat by showing pictures of the species from the Kimberley region. So unfortunately, that is a species I can't show today. The reason for that is that Aldrovanda only grows in large wetland swamp areas in the top end. And these are the exact same kind of habitats where there are also the large saltwater crocodiles that have an unfortunate habit of, well, attacking and sometimes even eating humans. So it's a bit dangerous for the unwary carnivorous plant enthusiast to search for Aldrovanda. The second genus we have in this area is Byblis, the rainbow plants. We have either 3 or 4 species. I'm not sure about the status of Byblis rorida. I think that's an unconfirmed report for the area as of now. Of course, we have Drosera, the sundews. We have 18 species in this area. Almost all of them belong to either the Drosera indica complex, section Arachnopus, or the Drosera petiolaris complex, which is also called Drosera section Lasiocephala. And finally, and most importantly, we have Utricularia. They make up the vast majority of the carnivorous plant diversity in the area, with more than 50 species that are known to occur there. And many of them are endemic and only occur there. And that number is also growing every year. I think just a couple of weeks ago, we got 2 or 3 more additional species from this area that were described for the first time. All right, the top end region of Northern Australia has a very seasonal climate with very pronounced wet and dry seasons. So in winter, which in Australia is about June, July, August, there's no rainfall whatsoever. It is really bone dry. Whereas in summer, in this case, December, January, February, March, there is a monsoon that arrives and brings strong flooding and heavy rainfall, sometimes even cyclones, tropical cyclones to the area. So we have a very pronounced difference in the climate between the dry and wet season, much more extreme than in other parts of Australia. And this is reflected in the carnivorous plants that can be found in the top end. Some only flower in the wet season during summer, but there are also some that only flower in the dry season because their habitats are simply completely flooded in the wet season. And I will show some of these differences in responses to rainfall during my presentation. Most of my presentation, however, will be from the wet season, because that's when most species, especially of Utricularia, can be found in flower in the top end. And the wet season is again characterized by spectacular climate, lots of rain, spectacular thunderstorms almost every evening, as can be seen here, a beautiful illuminated thunderstorm near sunset. Here's the same thunderstorm a little bit later, and a typical top-end wet season outback campground, bush campground, which I'm often using for my travels. Again, the wet season is characterized by strong flooding and waterfalls that flow really strongly. And this is an 80-meter tall waterfall near Darwin. That is just an absolutely spectacular sight during the wet season. In the dry season, most of the area turns into quite dusty and dry places like this one. This is a very famous spot in Kakadu National Park, very large termite mound. As you can see, the area surrounding this termite mound is really brown and dry. This picture was taken during the dry season. And to show you the contrast between dry and wet season, I will show you the same termite mound now during the wet season. And this is how it looks like in the wet. As you can see, the area is lush and green and it's flooded. And indeed, this is actually carnivorous plant habitat right here, right next to this famous termite mound where all the tourists go during the dry season. They have no idea that they are stepping on top of a carnivorous plant habitat, because this habitat is only active during the wet season. And I think I found 4 or 5 species right next to this termite mound. And here you can see Drosera aquatica, a sundew species. This is the first species that I'm going to present today. And in the bottom right, you can always see the species name. So you never get lost. You always know which species I'm talking about. Drosera aquatica is one of the Drosera indica complex species in the area, and it is quite a common species, and it's often, as the name suggests, occurring in quite wet and sometimes even flooded habitats. Characteristic for this species are the white hairs that are pictured here, that are found on the inflorescence as well as on the stem. This is quite distinctive and a good identification feature of Drosera aquatica. Here's the flower, close-up of the flower of Drosera aquatica. And towards the dry season, this species can also grow in more drier areas. As you can see here, a relatively dry, sandy area. And Drosera aquatica grows in this case together with Drosera burmannii, a very common rosetted sundew species at the top end. And there's also a Utricularia in the very back here, Utricularia crescenta, which I'm going to present later in this presentation. Very closely related to Drosera aquatica is Drosera nana. This species has white flowers, and it is also much smaller than Drosera aquatica. So Drosera aquatica usually has pink flowers. Drosera nana has white flowers and is much smaller, just 5 to 8 centimeters tall. And the white hairs of Drosera nana are also much shorter than the ones of Drosera aquatica, as can be seen here. Again, the flower is white in this case. One of the more uncommon Drosera species of the Northern Territory and the top-end region in particular is Drosera cuculata, which has this distinctive white flower with these large hooded and blood red colored stamens. These flowers are very distinctive and unlikely to be confused with any other species. If Drosera cuculata is not flowering, it can also be identified by this red stripe on the back side of the lamina, on the back side of the leaves, that, as far as I know, is not found in any other species of this affinity. So there are a number of more species in section Arachnopus, but in today's presentation, I really want to focus on the described species, because in fact, many of the undescribed species are species that I'm actually working on right now. So I thought it's better to only focus on the described species for this presentation, at least. Drosera aquatica and Byblis aquatica are seen in this picture. So I'm now going to present a few of the Byblis species. Byblis aquatica on the right is again carnivorous plant with sticky leaves like Drosera aquatica, but these two are not related. This is a case of convergent evolution evolving towards the same type of trapping mechanism to get additional nutrients. Byblis aquatica, similar to Drosera aquatica, tends to inhabit relatively wet places, sometimes even flooded places, as can be seen in this picture. Byblis aquatica is also usually kind of small species, just a few centimeters across. Byblis liniflora, another quite common species of the top end region. This is a quite spectacular place where it grows on along this sandstone creek. I think you can again see some Drosera burmannii growing with it. These pictures were taken during the dry season. So this is a place where you can only find Byblis liniflora during the dry season, because in the wet season, this exact same spot looks like this. So it's a completely flooded habitat during the wet season. And the plants likely are just getting flushed into the habitat as seed every year once the water levels recede. This is a vehicle track, actually. It's not a river, it's a vehicle track, but obviously it is not used during the wet season because it turns into a river. And these rivers and swamps are often good habitats for carnivorous plants. I'm now going to present some of the sundew species of the area. I will start with the pedularis, with the Drosera dilatatopetularis, which is probably the most common sundew of the top end. It's a very widespread species. It occurs in very different habitats. It occurs on sandstone, it occurs in wetlands and in relatively dry savanna habitats. And it's also really variable in terms of leaf length, in terms of petiole width, and also in plant color. Like these plants, for example, are more reddish than others, and these have longer petioles than others. And due to this extreme variation that is found in Drosera dilatatopetularis, I'm also including in this species some of the undescribed species that have been mentioned by previous authors. For example, Drosera afpetularis in T form. In my opinion, this is Drosera dilatatopetularis, or falls within the variation of dilatatopetularis at the moment. So it will take a lot more work to figure out what is going on in this complex, in my opinion. Here are some more pictures of different variations of Drosera dilatatopetularis. This is a beautiful form with small silver hairs on the petioles. One of the most amazing things about Drosera dilatatopetularis, and also some additional species, some other species of the Drosera petularis complex, is their response to fire during the dry season. So these pictures I've showed so far were all taken during the wet season, when the habitats look like this, very green grass, and the grass grows during the wet season. As you can see here, sometimes the grass gets really dense. There's the famous spear grass. If you have walked through the spear grass in about early April, mid-April, you will know why it is called spear grass. It has very spear-like seed that easily puncture almost everything, including your skin. So it's very uncomfortable, to say the least, to walk through these fields of speargrass during early April, when the plants are when the grasses are producing these spear-like seeds. However, a little bit later in the season, so by May and June, this speargrass turns into basically straw, very dry, brown, highly inflammable dead plants, basically. And it is very common that that early in the dry season, these are burned. And again, this is all Drosera dilatatopetalaris habitat. And after about 1 or 2 weeks after the fire comes through during the dry season, almost all the plants start to emerge. First the grasses and then also the Drosera. And I find it just absolutely amazing how these Droseras can grow and flower after a fire in bone dry soils. So these are not tuberous species where you could expect that they would have a reserve. They just have normal roots, and still they manage to flower and thrive in bone dry conditions following a fire. So these are really one of the most spectacular sights you can see during the dry season. When you look along the burned areas for these Drosera dilatatopetalaris, they really put on a show during the dry season. And you can also see that there's some variation in flower color. We have white flower plants and we have pink flower plants. That is again a typical feature of the Drosera petiolaris complex, where flower color tends to be quite variable. And not just flower color or petal color, but also the color of the styles. You can see on the right flowers here. We have pink style tips, whereas on the left we have white or pale pink styles. So there's lots of variation in color amongst these species. Next species is Drosera fulva, which you can see here growing together with Drosera dilatatopetalaris on the left. So Drosera fulva, another quite spectacular species during the wet season. There's usually shorter leaves and wider petioles than dilatatopetalaris, but the main feature is its extremely long inflorescence. Drosera fulva has these up to 50, 60 centimeter tall inflorescences that each have about 20 to 60 or even more flowers. So these are very characteristic for Drosera fulva. As you can see here, lots of flowers on each single inflorescence. And again, Drosera fulva can have white or pink flowers. Drosera brevicornis is probably a close relative of Drosera fulva. And as you can see here, it tends to grow it often grows in roadside habitats with some laterite gravel. It has a relatively hairy inflorescence and a distinctive, very large flower. Drosera brevicornis has the biggest or largest flower in the Drosera petiolaris complex with a diameter of up to 3 centimeters. Here are some close-ups of Drosera brevicornis. So the name Drosera brevicornis basically means short-horned sundew. And these horns are only visible in very close examination of the flower. What is meant by the name are these projections at the very end of each stamen. These are part of what's called the connective between the thecae of the anther. And these horn-like projections are the distinctive identification feature of Drosera brevicornis. I mean, you can identify it without looking that closely at the flower usually, but this is the final confirmation for identification of Drosera brevicornis usually. Sometimes these horns are also dark in color, as you can see in this flower, where it's very distinctive and quite easily to see. And it is quite easy to see these horns in this case. Again, the flowers of Drosera brevicornis are quite variable in color and not just in the petal color, but also in style color. Here's Utricularia brevicornis during the wet season. Very beautiful plant in my opinion, but it is even more beautiful towards the end of the wet season, just before it starts to go dormant. During this time, it starts to produce shorter and shorter leaves that are also getting progressively smaller in size. And it really looks very beautiful during that time of the year, which is towards the end of the wet season, just before it goes dormant. All right, Drosera falconeri, probably the most, one of the most distinctive species in the Pedicularis complex, and one of the most unique species of the top end, with its extremely wide lamina, almost resembling a little bit the Venus flytrap in general appearance. Really an interesting species, and this is also a classic wet season species. So it starts to go dormant pretty much immediately once the rainfall ends towards the end of the wet season. And it's best seen during the middle of the wet season. The species sometimes occurs in habitats that are seasonally or temporarily flooded during the wet season, and it's not uncommon for it to occur or to grow submerged below the water surface for short periods of time. I've included a short video of the habitat of Drosera falconeri. You can see the typical thunderstorms in the background of the wet season and the open swamp wetland habitat of Drosera falconeri. In this case, I think that the habitat was shallowly flooded and a few plants were even submerged. And yeah, this is how Drosera falconeri grows in the top end. All right, there are a few natural hybrids that I've seen so far with Drosera falconeri. Here on the left is a hybrid between Drosera brevicornis and Drosera falconeri. And the problem with that hybrid is that it is completely indistinguishable from another species that occurs in the top end, namely Drosera cornelii. So the hybrid and Drosera cornelii are completely indistinguishable unless they are flowering. So when they're not flowering, you can only identify cornelii and distinguish it from the falconeri hybrids using the habitat and the occurrence of potential parent species. All right, I'm now going to show some habitats from Kakadu National Park. And this place is really amazing. It's the second biggest national park in Australia. It has amazing sandstone plateaus, waterfalls, huge wetlands, and more. It of course has amazing carnivorous plant species and habitats, but also it has an amazing culture that is over 65,000 years old and continues today. It is the oldest living culture on the planet. It's really a special place, and whenever you visit it, you should really be very respectful in this area, and for example, not leave any marked trails during searching for carnivorous plants, for example. They are really quite sensitive to these issues because there are so many sacred sites in this area. So the most interesting parts of Kakadu National Park, in my opinion, are the sandstone plateaus, which are marked here in yellow. And one of the typical habitats you will find in these sandstone plateaus are these sea bitches. And whenever I see something like this, my heart rate goes up enormously because I know for sure that there's going to be a lot of interesting carnivorous plants in this kind of habitat. In this case, I found Drosera paradoxa, a typical species of Kakadu National Park. It only occurs in Kakadu National Park, and in also some parts of the Kimberley region of Western Australia. It is again a petiolaris complex species, but it produces these tall stems that are usually self-supported. So it can be up to 30 centimeters tall, kind of spectacular species. Here's a close-up of the flower. A similar species of the petiolaris complex, which also has these stems and upright growth habit, is Drosera banksii, although banksii is much smaller than Drosera paradoxa. Usually grows to just a few centimeters in height. Kind of looks similar to a tuberous sundew in, for example, here in Southwest Western Australia, but it's not at all related. It's definitely part of the Drosera petiolaris complex. It has very tiny white flowers, maybe 0.5 millimeter across in size. And the only species of the petiolaris complex that is even smaller than Drosera banksii is Drosera subtilis. And I think subtilis is also the smallest sundew of Northern Australia, at least in the top end region. The plants in the Kimberley, the forms of Drosera subtilis from the Kimberley tend to be a lot larger than this, but in the top end, Drosera subtilis is extremely small. These are just 2 or 3 centimeter tall plants, and the flowers may be 2 or 3 millimeters across, if that. Very tiny species, and it also tends to grow in these sandstone seepages in Kakadu National Park. All right, so this is a habitat of Drosera subtilis, but also of Utricularia dunlopii. And I'm now going to present some of the bladderwort species, some of the Utricularia species of the top end region. You can see it's a beautiful sandstone seepage again in Kakadu National Park with these sandstone escarpments in the background. And Utricularia dunlopii is a very distinctive and unique species of the top end region with its antennae-like flowers. It is part of the so-called Utricularia antennifera complex, which in top end has 3 members. It's always interesting to think about what might be the pollinators of these species with these antennae-like, very strange flowers. And indeed, this is one of the things that I'm studying as part of my PhD project. So I can't reveal too much for the moment, but there's progress being made towards finding out what is actually the pollinator of these very distinctive species. Here's a large population of Utricularia dunlopii. And here's a second member of the Utricularia antennifera complex. On the left, this is Utricularia capilliflora. And as you can see here, the color of the flower tends to be slightly different, usually a little bit brighter in capilliflora compared to dunlopii. And another good way to distinguish these two is by counting the number of filaments on the lower part of the flower. The capilliflora has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 filaments on the lower part of the flower, whereas it is 3 in Utricularia dunlopii. Some more pictures of Utricularia capilliflora. And the final member of the Utricularia antennifera complex that we have in the top end region is Utricularia dunstaniae. This is also by far the largest species of the complex, with a size of up to 6 centimeters. And it's also not related to the other species I mentioned before. Even though they look kind of similar, this appears to be again a case of convergent evolution towards adapting the same kind of pollination mechanism in phylogenetically distinct lineages. Again, I mentioned earlier that this species has quite large flowers. I guess it depends on how you define flower size, but the actual total length of the flower from top to bottom is up to 6 centimeters in this species, which, as far as I know, means that this is the biggest Utricularia flower, at least outside of South America, but definitely in Australia. I think in South America there may be Utricularia alpina, which sometimes may produce flowers of a similar size to this. What I also find really interesting about these antennae-bearing or antennae-flowered Utricularia species is how they unroll their flowers during the development of the flower. And these long antennae, like appendages, they are rolled and stacked on top of each other during the development of the flower. And then they are unrolling one after another during the development. I find this really interesting. And I was lucky enough to observe many different development stages of this flower during my visit to this particular site. And this is summarized here in this graphic. On the left is the developing flower bud, and then it starts to open and slowly unroll their extremely long antennae until it's finally flowering here. And the two right photographs are actually the seed capsule. So this part just falls off completely, and what is left behind is just the seed capsule. All right, another really amazing species of the top end is Utricularia singeriana. And unfortunately, photographs just don't do it justice. They don't do it justice regarding the flower color. This species has an extremely beautiful and distinctive flower color of iridescent purple, and it changes throughout the day, and depending on the viewing angle, it is extremely hard to photograph this, but it's just amazing to look at in the habitat of Utricularia singeriana in the top end region. It's always one of the most beautiful sites, in my opinion, in the top end. And the back side is also really interesting of the flower. The underside of the flower has this dark red coloration, which is also really unusual and not found in any other species, as far as I know. Utricularia singeriana tends to form quite sparse populations. It is unusual to find this many flowers in a single spot, as is shown in this particular photograph. This is in contrast to the next species, Utricularia arnhemica, which often forms dense populations of many hundreds or even thousands of plants that grow in the sandstone creeks of Kakadu National Park. You can see a large population of Utricularia arnhemica. And probably the most interesting feature of Utricularia arnhemica is the trap, or is its trap. So the flowers are relatively unconspicuous, but the traps are really unique in the top end. It has these extremely large, usually black or red or dark red colored traps that are formed on top of the soil surface. And these traps, for comparison, most bladderwort species have maybe up to 0.5 millimeter or 4 millimeter large traps, if that. Most have probably smaller traps than this. But in Utricularia arnhemica, the traps can be, or are usually, 1 centimeter in diameter. And if you count the long filiform trap appendages in front of the trap, the total length of the trap can be 2 centimeters, which means this species has the largest traps at least in Australia, and one of the largest traps of the genus. Utricularia lasiocaulis, this is a species that recently has undergone taxonomic revision. I think it was just a couple of weeks ago. This is what is shown here is actual Utricularia lasiocaulis, and this species has a hairy peduncle and inflorescence, as you can see here, or it is covered with short hairs, usually a significant part of the peduncle is covered, as is shown here. And the underside of the flower has this pale yellow or pale orange color that is also distinctive for Utricularia lanceolens. And this is the species that was one of the species that was recently described, Utricularia brennanii. It has a more distinctly three-lobed lower corolla lip that helps to distinguish it from lanceolens. The underside of brennanii is also of this orange or yellow color. As far as I know, Utricularia brennanii is quite a variable species. So all of these pictures I've identified as Utricularia brennanii based on the recent taxonomic revision. So if that is the case, this species appears to be quite variable in terms of flower size and shape. You can see some of them have quite distinctly three-lobed lower corolla lips, whereas others don't really have any three-lobed corolla lips and rather have a more triangular shaped corolla lip. A related species is Utricularia leptorhyncha. However, this species has a white colored underside. I always struggle a little bit identifying leptorhyncha, identifying lanceolens. The easiest way is really to turn the flower around and look at the color of the underside. In lanceolens and also in brennanii, the underside of the flower is orange or yellow. In leptorhyncha, the underside is always white Leptorhyncha is another quite variable species. Some of the more extreme variations I found have these very narrow corolla shapes. Utricularia bidentata is best identified by its fang-like pair of palate ridges in the center. So I'm talking about these two white ridges in the center of the flower that are raised above the rest of the flower and have a fang-like appearance. And in bidentata, there are two in the middle, whereas in Utricularia gaguccio, we have four of these ridges. We have two in the middle, two in the center, but we also have two lateral ridges that are usually purple in color. And these are quite distinctive in Utricularia gaguccio and help to identify this particular species. Gaguccio is a recently described species. Gaguccio is an Aboriginal name. I think it's important to point out here that taxonomy in Australia is shifting towards more and more providing Aboriginal names for new species. And this will only increase in the future, I think. And I think it's the right way to honor the people who own and manage the land where these species occur. Here are some more pictures of Utricularia gaguccio. You can again see the distinctive raised palate ridges. Utricularia hamiltonii, another relatively common species in the swarms of the top end. This species has a more squarish corolla lip or lower corolla lip. And one of the most interesting features of Utricularia hamiltonii are the fruiting peduncles. So once it has finished flowering, Utricularia hamiltonii will curve its wall inflorescence by 180 degrees and basically place the seed capsule in the water or just above the water. I'm not quite sure what the ecological function of that might be, but it's a very helpful and easy way to distinguish Utricularia hamiltonii from all other species except one. And this one other species is Utricularia hamata. Utricularia hamata is a species that I found in a top-end region in 2016, and I think it was not recorded from the area before, but it's actually not uncommon in a few areas of the top end. Utricularia hamata has interesting trap appendages. So this is the trap of Utricularia hamata. And the trap appendages have this interesting bifurcation towards their tips, which is not found in Hamiltonii and some other related species. And again, Utricularia hamata is the only other species that has this hook-shaped inflorescence or infructescence when the flower when flowering is finished and the plants are fruiting. So this is the fruit of Utricularia hamata that is actually seen here. Utricularia kamienskii, another distinctive species of the top end region. It has a strongly three-lobed lower corolla lip, and it is usually white flowered, although in some areas pink flower variants do occur. And Utricularia hamiltonia, Utricularia kamienskii, and the next species I'm going to present, Utricularia holtzii. These three species are only found co-occurring in the same kind of swamp habitats around Darwin and Kakadu National Park and other parts of the top end. You will often see these three species growing intermixed in the same kind of habitat. Here's Utricularia holtzii, another very distinctive species with its five-lobed lower corolla lip. It has white flowers or pale yellow flowers, but always a very distinctive five-lobed lower lip of the flower. In the top right of this photograph, you can actually see Drosera fulva, which I presented earlier. Here's Utricularia holtzii with some morning dew. And on the left is a very pale yellow flowered Utricularia holtzii, but this is about as much flower color variation as you will find in Utricularia holtzii. Another species with a five-lobed corolla lip, although much smaller in size, is Utricularia quinquedentata. You can see here in this picture just how incredibly small the species is. It is one of the hardest species to find unless you know exactly what to look for. This is about as close as I can get with my camera to the flowers of Utricularia quinquedentata. As you can see here, again, it has a five-lobed lower corolla lip. Another species with a five-lobed corolla lip is Utricularia cheiranthus. This species is really rare and uncommon, only known from a few places in Kakadu National Park. It is distinguished from Utricularia holtzii by its pink flower. So holtzii has the white flower, cheiranthus has a pink flower. And of course, finally, when I'm talking about Utricularia species with lobed corolla lips, one species that definitely should not be missed is Utricularia leptoplectra. Very distinctive species of the top end region with its two-lobed corolla lip. So this has a two-lobed corolla lip, is purple in color, and the underside of the flower is yellow, as you can see here on the top of this photograph. Another interesting feature of leptoplectra is the very long and narrow spur, which contains the nectar. And this probably indicates it is pollinated by some kind of moth or butterfly. So it would be really interesting to see a pollination process of this species. There's quite a bit of variation found in Utricularia leptoplectra, including a white flowered variant here in the bottom right. Another species that is quite common across the top end is Utricularia minotissima, a small pink flowered one. As you can see here, it is quite different to all the other species except Utricularia geoffroy, and Utricularia geoffroy can be distinguished by its two yellow blotches on the lower corolla lip. So the color pattern of Utricularia geoffroy is quite distinctive. Then we have two more species of Utricularia that are in different sections, Utricularia caerulea and Utricularia nivea. These two are closely related and best distinguished by their size and color. So these two photographs are roughly to size. Utricularia nivea is a much smaller species and is usually white flowered compared to caerulea, which is these purple or pale blue flower colors. I'm not going to show a lot of aquatic Utricularia species due to the simple reason I mentioned earlier, that these species tend to occur in the exact same habitat where unfortunately also the saltwater crocodiles are found. So unless you know exactly what you are doing, it is usually not a great idea to look for these species in the top end. So this was a swamp where I know that there were for certain no crocodiles. And that's why I could visit Utricularia mullerii in this swamp. So mullerii has these float structures that keep the inflorescence floating on top of the water surface. And if you are familiar with the Utricularia species of the east coast of the US, you are probably familiar with a similar structure. There are some species that have the similar floats as Utricularia mullerii. Here's a close-up of the flowers of Utricularia mullerii. Another aquatic species is Utricularia dempsei, as you can see here. It's a much smaller species than Utricularia mullerii, and it lacks the floating structures. Utricularia involvens, another characteristic species of the wetland areas of the top end. It has this distinctive twining inflorescence. And one interesting thing to note here is that the inflorescence is always twining in the same direction. So it's always twining counterclockwise when viewed from above, or to the right when viewed from the side. It is never twining clockwise. And interestingly, this is true across all Utricularia species with twining peduncles, except one species in Africa that twines the other way around, clockwise. So that's always something I find kind of interesting, that these species always twine in the same direction. Utricularia odorata, another yellow-flowered species, very similar to Utricularia involvens, but it doesn't have the twining inflorescence. So it is self-supported, but still quite tall. It can be up to 50 centimeters tall, but always self-supported and never twining. Utricularia chrysantha, another very variable and yellow-flowered species. Here are some variations that are commonly found in top-end region. All right, so there's just one more species to go, and that one more species is, in my opinion, probably one of the most, if not the most amazing bladderwort of the top-end region. And this species is only found on the sandstone plateaus, usually in Kakadu National Park, but also in some other areas of the top end. And it grows along these beautiful sandstone creeks and waterfalls that are found on top of these sandstone plateaus. And you can see here the typical habitat of this species. I'm talking about Utricularia fulva, which is endemic to the top end and occurs in these very beautiful places. And interestingly, this is a species that you just won't see in flower during the wet season. In the wet season, you will only see this, a non-flowering mat that is flooded by up to a meter of water, of fast-flowing water. So it grows as a rheophyte in fast-flowing water during the wet season. And it only starts to flower once the water levels drop enough during the dry season. But once they do, in about May, June, July, it starts to flowering en masse in these beautiful places and forms very large populations, real fields of Utricularia fulva flowers during the dry season. It's really kind of beautiful site. Utricularia fulva is also one of the most variable species of Utricularia. This is the typical form with the red dotted center, but there's also a purely red centered color variant of Utricularia fulva, and there's even a completely yellow flowered variant, although this may actually be an undescribed species. I'm not completely sure. And finally, here are all the different variations of Utricularia fulva that I've found so far. As you can see, it's really kind of amazing and variable species that grows on the sandstone plateaus of the top end. And well, with that, I'm finished with my presentation today. And thank you very much for listening. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them now, and I will now hand back to Kenny.
Thank you so much, Thilo. We have lots of questions coming in, but first I wanted just to let people know about the International Carnivorous Plant Society. All right, so the International Carnivorous Plant Society is having the 13th conference, international conference in Japan this year. It's going to take place in May, and we hope you can visit with us. It's hosted by 4 different carnivorous plant societies in Japan. And if you go to our website, carnivoروusplants.org, you can go to the conference link, or right here is the Japanese link. It's available in Japanese and English. The conference is going to be near Himeji Castle, which is a couple hours south of Tokyo with the bullet train. The conference is May 26th through May 31st. The main conference is the 26th, 27th, 28th, but then there's a couple of additional add-on field trips that I've been told you should definitely attend. Here's a couple of pictures of the different places that we're going to visit on the conference. We're going to see a lot of unique native Japanese carnivorous plants, as well as carnivorous plants from all over the world that are cultivated there. The biggest thing to keep in mind is that the deadline for registration, if you want to be a presenter, if you want to attend the banquet and the field trips, the biggest thing is the deadline is March 31st. All right, we love our members at International Carnivorous Plant Society. We want to give you a premium education. So we offer you webinars. We offer you different animated videos that you can share in classrooms or young hobbyists, growers, students. And then we host the World's Carnivorous Plant Day every year. Well, we need your help. We need you. So if you could help support the International Carnivorous Plant Society, an easy way to support us is by becoming a member. Another thing that you could do is, once you're a member, you get access to the seed bank. And by going to the seed bank and buying seeds, you can also support the ICPS. Another thing you can do is purchase merchandise. So in a minute, you're going to see my shirt. I have a World's Carnivorous Plant t-shirt on. We have mugs and t-shirts and tote bags and stickers and beer coolers and all this stuff. And when you buy those, it directly supports our education and our conservation initiatives. Every August for the past 2 years, we've been able to give over 20 grants to classrooms from all over the world to add carnivorous plants to their classrooms. So we also need your help for this. If you want to directly donate to that, you can go to carnivorousplantsplants.org/donate, and then we can even fund more classrooms. Another thing that you could help us out with is advertising. because every September and October, I get emails saying, hey, I'm a teacher. I didn't know you had a classroom grant. And I always tell them you have to wait until August. So it's great if you could help us spread the word. So like I mentioned, we host World Carnivorous Plant Day. If you go to our website, carnivorousplants.org, there's a drop-down menu, and you'll see that it's always the first Wednesday of May. And on that day, we host or we publish over 24 videos from scientists like Theo and nurserymen and conservationists. This, of course, is all free. It's on our Facebook page and our YouTube page. Another part of World Carnivorous Plant Day is that we have a photo contest. If you're watching this video, you can submit 5 photos. The deadline is April 14th. The judges for this year are going to be the 3 winners of last year. Everybody gets to enter 5 photos. The details are also on our website, carnivorousplants.org. And the top 3 winners receive a 1-year membership to ICPS. And just a reminder, World Carnivorous Plant Day this year is Wednesday, May 5th. All right. Thank you, everyone, for my little advertisement. And now, Theo, you're still unmuted, so I'm going to read you a couple of questions that hopefully you can answer. Okay, Remco wants to know, if he was able to convince his significant other to visit the top end of Australia, which month would you suggest to do so he can act surprised by how many carnivorous plants there are at their peak? What month or what season is the best time to visit?
Not the wet season. If you're going, if you're going to visit it with someone who is not absolutely hardcore interested in carnivorous plants, don't go during the wet season, because it is incredibly hot and humid, and all the parks and all the tourist attractions are closed during the wet season. And you have very restricted with what you can do during the wet season. Most hotels and caravan parks don't even open during the wet season in that area. So I highly recommend visiting during the dry season, say June, July, even August, still a great month. So despite the fact you will see less species, especially less Utricularia species, you still can see lots of Drosera, like, for example, I showed earlier the Dilatatopetalus, which flower en masse during the dry season after fire, or Utricularia fulva, which grows right at the tourist attractions, basically. These waterfalls and sandstone creeks, these are the tourist attractions where everyone goes. And that's exactly where the Utricularia fulva is also found. It's really not hard to find. So yes, June, July, August would be my recommendation.
Very good. James would like to know, generally speaking, are most of these Utricularia annuals due to the seasons and lack of tubers?
Yes, so I'm pretty sure that most of them are indeed annuals, given that it's just bone dry during the dry season. And most of these habitats indeed do dry out completely. So they will perinate as seed only during the dry season for most species. There may be some exceptions to this, but most Utricularia species certainly grow as annuals.
Robert has a question about the Drosera that grow on the laterite. Do you know if you can grow them in cultivation?
I'm not particularly experienced with cultivating carnivorous plants. I'm really mostly a field-based researcher, but I do know that many of these species that prefer different kinds of soil conditions in the wild can actually be grown under the exact same conditions in cultivation, which is surprising for me as a field researcher, because I would assume that each need these kind of specific soil conditions. But it turns out in cultivation that is apparently not as important. So I would assume in this case that the laterite for this particular species would not be essential for its cultivation.
All right, I think we have one last question, and it's from Remco. And before I read this, Thilo and I, before we started, we were a little nervous about people attending because Thilo said it's 3 a.m. somewhere in the world, but we had a great turnout. We had almost 20 people attend this live webinar, so that was very well attended. And I'm excited when we post it, we're going to get even more views. So Remco wants to know, what camera do you use in the field to get those macro views?
I've used a number of different cameras over the years, but I think these quinquedentata pictures, these were taken with a Lumix G85 something DSLM camera, heavy, that has a stabilization mechanism inside. So you can actually take these macro photographs without any kind of special setup. Also have a macro lens that I can use, and an additional macro lens that I can stick on in front of that other macro lens in order to get really close-up pictures of extremely small species like quinquedentata. So it's nothing really that unusual or special. It's really just hard to find and photograph these tiny species.
All right, so Thilo, you have lots of congratulations, and they enjoyed your presentation. So you can read those in the chat. But for everyone else, we really appreciate you attending. And Thilo's advisor is Adam Cross. And in a couple of weeks, Adam will be doing a webinar for the ICPS on Aldrovanda. So even though Thilo says he doesn't have photos, I bet Adam does, since he wrote the giant book about them. All right, so until next time, thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you very much.
The International Carnivorous Plant Society wants you to be successful with your plants. We welcome growers just getting started all the way through professional scientists. We started an annual World Carnivorous Plant Day to celebrate these spectacular plants. Take a look around our website and you'll find historic documents about carnivorous plants, growing guides, free educational resources, and more. Have questions? Ask. We don't bite, but our plants do.